Welcome to this episode of Quake It Up. In this episode, we're carrying on the history playlist and we move finally on to the 18th century, the long 18th century it's sometimes called. Do not worry though, we will return to the 17th century. As I said in another video, I can't remember which one now, I'm going to do a series of vignettes of like important Quakers in that period and important scenes. So I'm wanting to do something like following George Fox through 1652 country and how he did that and why he did that maybe, and things like that. So we will return, but we must also move forward. Now, whereas the 17th century for Quakerism is held in very high regard by Quakers today and historians, the 18th century has a very bad reputation. There is some revisionist work going on to try and make it seem better, but it's, I think, probably the century that is least liked amongst Quakers. So we're going to be looking at, well, why? We've kind of hearkened to a couple of reasons why that might be in the previous episodes towards the end of the 17th century. So this is mainly a carrying on of that. Maybe maybe you could even say a radicalization of some of those points which were raised in the previous video. So the way that I currently see this, I'm going to do at least 3 videos on the 18th century. And it's called the long 18th century. I'm not sure if that's just a Quaker term, but the reason for that is because unlike any other century, it eats into both ends. So you could consider that 18th century Quakerism began maybe even as early as 1660 and ends all the way up to 1830. For this video, though, I'm kind of limiting it to 1723, and then I will get to 1830. So I mean, it is a long century. Before we really get into the history as to what happened when and those sorts of things, I think a really important term that we have to understand when doing this period is the word Quietist. It's a term which is quite often used to define this long century. It's known as the Quietist period of Quakerism, and is much maligned and has been given a really bad rap. And whilst I'm not necessarily looking to reincorporate it and justify it necessarily, I think it's a very important area of Quakerism. And I think Quakers, when they really think about it, a lot of the things that actually today Quakers are quite proud of come from this area. A lot of very important figures as well. So it's not all bad. But Quietism is a term which I think needs some explaining. Because, yeah, silent meeting for worship surely is quiet most of the time. What's wrong with that? What could possibly be wrong with that phrase, I suppose? Now, I don't know if this is necessarily just Rufus Jones, but this is a very Rufus Jonesian way of seeing this era. He saw this era of Quakerism to be the worst, and because he has had such an effect and such an important role in shaping Quaker history or historiography, shall we say, it means that his view has lasted for maybe longer than it should. I've done a video on the book review on Rufus Jones, so please do check that out. But effectively, what Rufus Jones is best known for is defining Quakerism less by its Puritan background and more by its mystical background. And he kind of sees Quietism as an outflow of that. To help me with this, with these videos, I had to move on because we're beyond the early Quakers and their theological thought. By the way, the reason why I'm saying 1723, because this was the death of George Whitehead, who was the last Valiant 60 member to die. So he lived a very long time. He was very young when he was a Valiant member of the Valiant 60, but nonetheless. So moving on to Quakerism in the Atlantic world, which goes from 1690. So see, there you go. So that's probably going from the Act of Toleration in 1689, maybe, up until 1830. So this is what I mean. It's a porous period. But I'm also getting in Pink Dandelion, Introduction to Quakerism as well. So those are going to be the books that I'm going to be using to explain this period. So the article that I think is most important for this one is 3 Methods of Worship in 18th Century Quakerism by John Mitchell. And he goes for this straight on. So he says, since the work of Rufus Jones almost a century ago, 18th century Quaker worship has been associated with the Catholic Quietist mysticism of Madame Guyon, François Fénelon, and Miguel de Molinos. Now, all of these were contemporaneous with the early Friends, but obviously it's Catholic. Quakers and Catholics weren't necessarily best of friends at that time. So already it's kind of a bit odd because, hang on, this was an established movement in the Catholic tradition. How are you linking this to Quakerism, which were fundamentally, as Englishmen of the time and Protestants at the time, very much opposed to anything Catholic? And the way that he does that is he says that this is all a further outspring from medieval mystics. So these are people like Johannes Tauler and Meister Eckhart. Johann Böhmer probably is another big one that Rufus Jones particularly liked as this sort of early source from the medieval period that then naturally flowed through a series of ideas and people reading books apparently to Quakerism being founded the way that it was. It's also important to note that the Catholic Church didn't appreciate the Catholic Quietists either, mainly. So I suppose maybe that's a plus side for them from George Fox and Quakers. That if these are Catholic, yeah, but it's fine. But the Catholics don't actually like it either. Then maybe we can like it. But what actually was Catholic Quietism? So if we're going to be applying this to 17th, 18th century Quakerism, then what was it? And we'll see whether this is actually the case. It can be summarized in 4 beliefs, I suppose, or practices. So we could look at absolute surrender. So the idea that complete abandonment of the self to God, passive contemplation, so silent inward prayer to achieve a union with God. So moving away maybe from more structured forms of prayer from a Catholic tradition, and active meditation where you're actively praying. Detachment, so putting yourself away from worldly desires and from the world, capital W, and this idea of mystical union. So the idea that you can become, by doing all of the above, you can reach a state of union with Christ or union with God. This is the status that we're trying to get to. Now, looking at that, one can argue that, yes, there's quite a lot of links there. If you just take it purely on those terms, there's a lot of things which, yes, when we go into actually how did 18th century Quakers practice, there's a lot of that. The idea of it's more about emptying yourself so God can come in, so reducing the self, and what you're trying to do instead of maybe actively listening is more passively listening. So your role is more passive. So these are all characteristics of 18th century Quaker worship. So it seems okay. I suppose maybe something that we might want to maybe push back on that with, though, is the idea that the efficacy of what humanity can do when it comes to prayer or a spiritual life with God it is quite reduced at this period. In this period, no matter what denomination you're in, if you look at Calvinists, for example, they believed in total depravity. So this idea that it was impossible for humans to do anything that was worthy or anything like that. So certainly in terms of their prayer, if you believed in total depravity, then surely that would mean that, well, you can't pray very well. The best you can do is do what you're told, which is quite, I suppose, passive way of looking at it. So it doesn't have to just be from these Catholic Quietists. This could also be seen as quite a Calvinist belief as well. I suppose it's important to say that Quietism doesn't just mean it's quiet. I think a lot of what is said about the Quietist period of Quakerism is that Quakers became afraid to give ministry, because that's not what they were thinking they were doing. They thought that they had to, as I said, empty themselves in order for God to come in. But this isn't the case. It's not like you went to a Quaker meeting in the 18th century and no one would speak. What it did become more, though, is that the role of ministers or recognized ministers became a lot more apparent, and they were kind of expected to speak and others were maybe less expected to speak. So it's not like it was completely silent and that's what they were trying to do. So it became more contemplative and more meditative, I suppose. It's simply that there was a growing understanding that the listening was maybe more important and that there were some who were more likely to give ministry, and so one should expect that more than necessarily that you'll have received a leading. Seems, though, reading Mitchell's article, that that this isn't necessarily what Quietism was. So these 4 points that I mentioned earlier isn't necessarily precisely what Quietism was in the Catholic sense, so that it was maybe a lot more effortful. It was a lot more effortful to get to this sort of passive state. You can't just go in straight into that passive state. There were certain practices, there were certain, I wouldn't say rituals, but there were prayers to follow, there was a system to follow to get to that ultimate state. Whereas this isn't obviously what Quaker meeting is. Quaker meeting is very much you come in and you're expected to be in that state kind of straight away, which is hard, and but not the same. So he says the incorrect assumption that Catholic Quietists advocated a wholly passive and unorthodox practice has been assimilated into Quaker history since Rufus Jones's account of the Quietist Quakers. So we come to believe that this is what the Catholic Quietists were. They were out of favour in the Catholic Church. Because they had this all similar mystical wellspring. They kind of fed from each other, feeding in from a maybe more radical Protestant understanding of this, and it came all together as Quaker worship, as coming to fruition into the 18th century when the maybe more radicalism, the performance theology of the mid 17th century died away. This is what took its place. So what were the 18th century Quakers actually doing in meeting for worship then? So if we're following this Quietist stance, the idea should be that we should be pulling ourselves away. We should be sitting in this complete passive state, and if leadings come our way, then that's brilliant, but we're not going actively out there into that space in order to find messages, I suppose. Actually was fitting in with a lot of much wider what we will be talking about in this period. This isn't actually what Quakers were feeling. They weren't emptying their emotions. They were, when they were in expectant waiting. They were, as Mitchell says, imbued with fear, humility, self-abasement, awe, and reverence. So this isn't a complete removal of the self. It's maybe not what I would feel during a Quaker meeting for worship, but this is certainly what they felt. And we'll talk about maybe why they felt that in meeting for worship, maybe in the next video. But this isn't a complete removal of the self. This is maybe a bit more of a Puritan, we're totally depraved, or we're not able to do this. I'm just lowly me, I'm not worthy, that sort of thing, rather than completely taking yourself out of it. He gives a good example of how this might look from an 1816 Quaker pamphlet, which was called Christian Instruction in a Discourse Between a Mother and Her Daughter, where the daughter is having issues with Quaker in meeting, and I wonder how many of us have maybe felt some of this as well. She goes, "I'm afraid he being God, I'm afraid he has cast me off. My thoughts ramble so. I cannot get my mind stayed when I wish to wait on the Lord." If we were following a true, maybe Catholic Quietist understanding of this, or a Quietist understanding of this, then it might be about effortful recollection. So you might then, you need to do this prayer, you need to do this prayer in order to then reach this mystical union. But that's not what she does, the mother. So the mother says, "That, my dear, is the one thing that gives thee a clear sense of thy weakness, and how little thou canst do for thyself, and by which thou mayst be instructed to depend on the Lord for everything." So that's more the Quietist, the Quaker Quietist perspective, is that we don't have the agency to do that anyway. And of course you can't. Only God can do that, which I think is still a more Puritan aspect of Quakerism than anything to do with this Catholic Quietist movement. This isn't to say that Quakers at the time weren't referencing the Catholic Quietists. They certainly were. So I think this muddies the waters slightly, because it's not that there was just no connection. There was a connection, but I think they were appropriating it in a Quaker way under a Puritan lens, if you see me. So it's not the same as just, oh, this is great, let's do that. This Madame Guyon, she sounds fantastic, let's just do exactly what she says. Not at all. They don't do that. They take certain phrases from her, they incorporate it and re-understand it in a Quaker / Puritan mode, and then they're using that to describe their experience of what they're seeing in meeting. Another thing, and maybe why this Quietist might not be a very good label, is because actually, strangely, this is a time when how you gave ministry took on a very strange turn. Now, when you talk about how people give ministry today, you might say there is a certain way that people give ministry. It tends to be quite slow. So when people give ministry, there's a lot of pauses. But that's not quite what I'm talking to. Here, this is going from Pink Dandelion. He says that ministry at this time was given a distinct nasal tone to differentiate the divine message from the human vessel. I'm not quite sure how that would sound. Maybe I should try that next time. So there we go. That is a very important word for this topic. And I think a good one to sort of introduce this period as well, because we're sort of starting to get the sense of where the worship is at. And if this is where the worship is at, the influence that that then later has on the greater Quaker life can start to be gleaned. And this is what we're going to be getting into next time. And the key word that we're going to be looking at there is the word discipline. So look forward to that one. I'll see you then.
Thank you very much for watching the video. If you liked it, please do click on the thumbs up and the subscribe button to get more videos about Quakerism in the UK today. It really does help, and thanks once again.